Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy session on strategies for preservation. We will be recording this meeting, so you'll see that notice as you log in. We'll give folks a second to log in, and we'll start at roughly 10:02. So we'll give some folks some time to log in. Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll get started this morning. My name is Robin Wolf. I work with Enterprise Community Partners, and you're taking part in the Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy session, Strategies for Preservation. Of course, this is a virtual meeting, and as a consequence, we have a few housekeeping notes for you. The webinar is being recorded, and all the audience members are muted as you log in. So you don't have to worry about that. You're muted and we cannot see your cameras. Please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature in order to submit questions. I highly encourage questions. It makes the sessions more interesting and more interactive. After the presentation, we're going to open up the lines for some more questions, and you can use the raise hand feature as well should you want to speak live, or you can also indicate that to me in the chat. And then I can open up your phone line and we'll let you ask your question yourself. Otherwise, they'll just come and you get to hear me read your question via the chat feature. All participants will receive a copy of today's webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides. So anybody who's here on the call will get a copy of the recording and of the PowerPoints that we'll be delivering today. And of course, this is a strange new world that we live in, and please be patient if we have technical difficulties as we are all interacting and reacting within a space that is more familiar to us than it was 6 months ago, but still a little bit foreign territory. Today, we will start off with some welcome and introductions, and then we'll be talking about using portfolios to promote preservation. We'll have a short 5-minute break just so everybody can refresh their coffee, attend to their emails, and then come back being focused on financing tools for multifamily preservation and questions and wrap up. As I said, I work for Enterprise Community Partners, and our vision is that one day every person will have an affordable home in a vibrant community filled with promise and the opportunity for a good life. And our mission is to create opportunity for low and moderate income people through affordable housing in diverse and thriving communities. The Rural and Native American program provides funding and training and technical assistance to organizations to help create healthy, safe, green, and affordable housing in both rural and Native communities. And our priorities consist of preservation of affordable rental housing through the technical assistance and the delivery of training such as this one, and peer learning sessions designed to help rural housing providers acquire and or preserve rent-restricted housing in their communities. So if you have any questions about specific projects or specific things that you're working on and we'd like some technical assistance or like some further thought, please reach out to us. We're always happy to look at projects and to help you think through solutions, particularly regarding preservation in rural space. The Colorado Rural Housing Preservation Academy is a series of no-cost trainings and peer learning sessions designed to help rural housing providers and nonprofits acquire and preserve housing. And our ultimate goal is to preserve housing options for low-income rural populations in the state of Colorado. We launched this in Texas in 2018. And we're here in Colorado in 2020, and I think this is our 7th session. So thanks for coming through with us for so many sessions. And we have plans to be in Pacific Northwest and then in the Southeast next year in 2021. And just so y'all can see kind of where we are in this process, we started with conversations about the landscape and identifying homes, looking at the database that CHFA has, and also that USDA has available to us. If you would like more information on that, you can always review the recordings of those sessions or just reach out to me directly. We've talked a bit about pre-development, looking at building conditions and resident needs, looking at the funding, the 515 existing financing, if that's part of it. Also, just the CNA, the capital needs assessment. Now we're kind of talking more about acquisition and rehab. How do we finance that? How do we make sure that everything that needs to happen in terms of rehab is done? And our sessions toward the end will focus more on stewardship, things around property management, and also in October we'll be talking about policies that help to promote preservation in general. I also have to thank our partners. The Colorado Health Foundation is the signature sponsor for this whole academy, and Fannie Mae and the Colorado Trust are also sponsors of this work as well. Of course, we also need to thank our USDA RD office here in Colorado, CHFA, the Colorado Division of Housing, and you guys who are here and make these events possible. So now we get to the meat of the conversation. We are joined today by Russell Merrill. Russell Merrill is of Chrisman Development. He began working in real estate in 2005 and is focused exclusively on affordable housing development since 2010. He has overseen the development of projects located throughout the state of Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and with responsibilities that include property acquisitions, successful applications for financing LIHTC or low-income housing tax credits, related programs, oversight of property construction and rehab, and asset management. So we're really excited to hear from Russell about how they have used a portfolio as a strategy for preservation. Often we've had some conversations about how it is hard to make these projects pencil, and I think the idea of acquiring 515 projects, USDA 515 projects in a portfolio is one way that we have seen them pencil better. So Russell, thank you and welcome. Adrian will share your slides. This should be coming up in just a second, and you can get started.
All right, thank you, Robin. I appreciate this opportunity to talk about the things that have been successful for our company, being with the portfolio acquisition. And as a starter, I'll just give a little bit of background on myself. As Robin said, my background is as a CPA. When I graduated from college, I worked for Deloitte in their tax department for about 5 years, at which time I was interested in real estate. And so I became involved in commercial acquisition, and investments and development. And I did that for about 3 to 4 years until the real estate crisis occurred in 2008 and 2009, at which time I became involved with the affordable housing. And I've been part of that ever since. So, next slide, please. In the presentation today, I'm going to cover a number of topics that I've listed here. The first is just a brief discussion of the 515 rural development properties and why preservation is such an important component for those properties. And we'll talk about preservation using the portfolio structure and what's required. We'll talk about the deal structure, look at the benefits and some of the difficulties with using a portfolio. We'll go through the process itself, and I'll show you some examples of what we've done in Oregon using both 9 and 4% tax credits as the foundation for the portfolio. And then we'll talk about some of the important criteria to help your success with portfolios, and then we'll wrap it up from there. The next slide, please. And if you see me looking to the side, it's my teleprompter. Sometimes I need a little help to stay on topic. So with the rural RD 515 properties, what's really important in the history with those is they really started to be developed in the late 60s to mid 70s, and they ramped up through the mid 70s and through the early 80s. And then the 1986 Tax Act put an end to it. And this is not just true for the 515, but also for a lot of the Section 8 programs, that those programs changed at that point in time. And so really the whole body of properties that are available were developed during that roughly 15-year period. And what they both have in common is a rental assistance component that helps pay the rent on those properties on behalf of the tenants. And part of the history with the financing structure to these properties is that they were formed into limited partnerships, primarily for tax advantaged investors. And these were typically high wealth individuals who would invest in these properties for the tax benefits. And that was really how the developer was paid, and was through those investors. The USDA or HUD would fund a loan that would cover the hard costs, but the development fees and some of the syndication costs were all paid by these investors. In return, they received the pass-through tax benefits of these properties. So they were really, from an investment standpoint, they were used for their tax benefits. And when the 1986 tax law was changed, those benefits disappeared for those investors. They were no longer realizable. And so what you ended up with was a lot of these properties owned by limited partnerships, where you have a general partner who in a lot of cases was the builder or the developer of these properties, and anywhere from 10 to 50 limited partners who own minor shares, either half a percentage of ownership up to 2 or 3%, but there was a large number of limited partner investors. And that becomes important when you look at going through the transfer process that we'll talk about a little bit later. And also, given the end of this program in the mid-'80s, we're now starting to see that this group of properties that are funded through this mechanism are really starting to age, and they're becoming in high need of recapitalization, rehabilitation, and there have not historically been a lot of mechanisms to accomplish that, given that the foundation for almost all affordable housing now is the 4% and 9% low-income housing tax credits. But what really makes these properties worth preserving is not just the fact that they represent housing to a very small, limited markets, especially in the rural development properties, but they also are attached to the rental assistance. And that rental assistance is no longer widely available. So what we have as a portfolio of products out there in the Section 8 and the 515 is the bulk of what's available that really supports the extremely low income population. Next slide. So the first thing is we're looking at portfolio preservation and the ability to fund, put together portfolios, is we really have to look at the environment within the state or the jurisdiction where these properties are located. Because of the foundation of the program is the 9% and 4% tax credits, the properties have to be located within the same state, for starters. I'm not aware of any ability to create a portfolio across state lines, because you're looking at different issuing agencies for those tax credits. And you're also looking for a single bond issuance. Because of the underlying debt and restrictions on the property, you're not going to be able to cross collateralize those properties with different bond issuances. So you need a single bond issuance for the properties. And then you also want to look at your source of tax credit equity. We've been able to do portfolios with both 9% and 4% tax credits. And we'll talk about more of the criteria with those later on in the presentation on which ones work in different areas, but in different states. But in our experience, especially with the 4%, you really have to have the availability of some additional gap funding sources, either from a federal level with the home, CDBG, Federal Home Loan Bank funds, or a state basis where you have the energy rebates, and particularly where we do a lot of our rehabilitation, acquisition rehabilitation in Oregon, they have a number of funds available that also help fill that gap created with the 4% tax credits. And then of course, there's always your local funds, which are more typical in urban environments, which don't necessarily apply very frequently to 515 properties, but there are some fee waivers of things on a local level that you can use to help fund that gap. So one thing you have to be aware of when you're using the 4% is that you're probably also going to be assembling a lot of sources of funding to help make that financially feasible. With the 9, you obviously have a lot more flexibility with the financing side, but the competitive nature of those allocations can make that difficult in itself. When you look at the 9% as a portfolio, you really have to know the QAP and the funding priorities of the state you're in to determine whether or not a 9% is feasible. And the states that we've had experience in Oregon has a very strong support of preservation. And so their QAP makes 9% feasible. And we've done a number of properties with that where we've had properties in the location or meets the criteria to, sorry, I was reading the question that popped up. Lost my track of thought, but the QAP supports preservation. And so when you put in a 9% application, you do stand a fairly good chance of being competitive. On the other hand, when we've done work in Idaho, they do not have a strong 4% program in Idaho, and there's very limited resources for your gap financing. So you're almost limited to the 9% round, which is competitive. And historically, they do have a set aside for preservation, but it's only enough to fund on average, one property per cycle. And so your competition, if you're trying to rehab with 9% in Idaho, is fairly high. And then, of course, this is our first application we've put together for Colorado, and they have a number of additional soft funding programs available with their state tax credits. Utah also has a state tax credit, which helps make the 4% more feasible, even though that is also competitive. Plus, through DOLA, they have home and CDBG funds that can help fill that gap. So 4% as a portfolio is feasible. In Colorado, it's feasible. In Oregon, really not feasible. In Montana or Idaho, the states where we're familiar with. And that's just due to the structure of funding within that state. I saw a question that kind of gets to the meat of why a portfolio. And they were asking, how do you preserve these 10 and 24 unit properties? And that's the whole reason behind the portfolio, is that you're starting to aggregate these smaller properties. Typically, when we look at a 4%, we can probably go to the next slide because that starts to discuss some of that, the benefits to that. And usually when I'm looking at a property, the minimum floor for a 4% bond to me is probably, depending on other source of finance funding that's available, is probably 60 to 80 units. And as we all know, when we're looking at rural 515 properties that average between probably 20 and 40 units per property, that you're just not going to meet that threshold. And so by aggregating multiple properties together, you can get the scale that's necessary to support the cost of a 4% bond issuance. For example, in the Colorado portfolio that we've submitted in this most recent round for tax credits and state tax credits, I started out with 5 properties identified. And due to some criteria on one of the properties, we ended up dropping that property and just going with 4 of the properties. But in total, I have 118 units between 4 properties scattered across 3 communities. There are 2 properties in Estes Park, 1 in Brighton and 1 in Lyman. And so I now have 115 unit property in essence that I'm able to justify the cost structure behind the 4% tax credits. And so some of the benefits that you receive from a portfolio is really increased access, reach, impact with your rehabilitation. If you're looking at a single property through a 9%, using Idaho as an example, where you're only going to get realistically allocated 1 property a year. If you own 5 or 6 properties in rural properties in Idaho, and you're submitting 1 property a year, and you have about a 30 or 40% chance of getting tax credits, it could take you 10 or 15 years to rehabilitate all 6 of your properties. With combining those into a portfolio in the states where that's a feasible structure, now you can take potentially all 6 of your properties at one time, put them together into one application, and try to obtain the financing and funding to address those needs at one time. And so by doing that, we're able to basically preserve more of those properties in a shorter amount of time. And we have greater access to financing. If you're working with rural small properties, that can sometimes be your biggest barrier, is attracting the resources necessary to rehabilitate that property. Additionally, a benefit is there's a flexibility with allocating resources. Typically, unless you can consolidate the properties into a single property with RD, you are somewhat limited with your debt allocation to the properties. You'll have your 515 debt, which is pre-existing on these properties. that gets assumed by the LIHTC entity, and RD allows that that debt to be reamortized. You have the 538 debt that you can add on top of that. But then you have your tax credit equity, which is coming in, and that tax credit equity can be allocated to properties with a greater need. When this particular property, portfolio of properties in Colorado that we put together, 2 of the 4 properties were older and had a lot more deferred maintenance than 2 of the other properties. And so as a whole, our resources, are 75,000 per unit for the rehab. But on an individual property level, one of the properties may actually be utilizing 85 or 90,000 per unit in rehab, where another property, to bring it to a similar state of rehab, might only require $50,000 or $55,000 per unit worth of rehab. And so you have that flexibility. And there's also a distributed cost structure with bond financing. A lot of your financing costs are relatively fixed, whether you're doing 50 units or you're doing 120 units. The cost, the variable cost is minor. A good example are your bond counsel fees. If I have a property that is 60 units that I'm trying to do a 4% bonds, that bond counsel may cost me $45,000 to $50,000. If I have 120 units, that cost may go up to $60,000 or $65,000, but it's being spread across more properties and more units and lowers my overall cost of the bond issuance. There's also what I spoke about a little bit earlier. When you're dealing with small properties, it's hard to attract the lenders and investors. They, just like most developers, prefer the bigger the deal, the better. You're putting in the same amount of work, but you get better pricing, you get better loan terms, and you have a wider variety of lenders and investors who are interested in your property with the bigger properties. So trying to get someone to invest in 24 units in a rural community, your available partners for that is going to be local banks on the lending side, and you may have absolutely little to no luck finding an investor who will come in on a property that size. There just isn't the return on the investment for the amount of work that goes into it. So it does increase that ability. With the 4%, in most states, the 4% are non-competitive. And so from my experience with the 9% tax credits, not only do you have the competition for those tax credits, but the allocating agencies and the jurisdictions and states that they reside in are also utilizing the 9% tax credits to meet additional social goals that they might have within that state, whether it's homelessness, special needs housing. Maybe their focus is on new construction and adding units rather than preserving existing units. And so there's a lot of competing interests for those 9%, and where those exist with, like mass transit oriented developments, if that's a focus that they're trying to add additional units, you're just not going to be competitive with a rural property. And so that's really a lot of the incentive that we've had with looking at the 4% bonds is trying to avoid that competition and competing requirements that go into a lot of the 9% tax credits. And then the economic impact that these redevelopments provide to the rural communities really is a huge benefit to the residents and to that local town or jurisdiction where it's located. When you're going in and doing the rehab, you're using a lot of the local labor, whether it be plumbing, electrical, contractors, subcontractors. A lot of those are drawn from the local economy. And, you know, to bring $2 million, $1.5 million into a local economy is a real positive boost, in addition to taking what was probably perceived as a rundown or property that is not embraced by the community to one that really stands out and has improved the living conditions for the residents who live there and reside in that community. The other big benefit through the rehab is that you end up at the end of the day with a reduced operating cost structure. A lot of these properties that are 25, 30 years old are requiring $25,000 to $30,000 a year of annual maintenance just to keep them in their current state. And that cost, especially with the 515 program, you know, is being funded through the rental assistance and the funding from RD. And by completing the rehab, you may now drop those annual operating maintenance costs in a third or a fourth of what they were before. And that frees up additional resources to pay for the additional debt that you're going to bring into the property to pay for that rehab. Let me take a look real quick at the questions, see if I've addressed them. The first was, are you acquiring all the properties individually before applying for 4% tax credit? If so, what funds do you use for acquisition? I will address that question on the next slide. That's a very critical component to the portfolio, and I'll talk, and it's a barrier, and I'll talk about that. Small organizations typically don't have much in the way of equity capital. Can you give us an idea of the capital you injected into your 115 unit project? That's going to be on the next slide too, when I talk about some of the barriers, because it is expensive to put these portfolios together. And I'll go ahead and address both those questions here on the next slide. So some of the barriers to putting together these portfolios, as was asked in the previous question, probably the most significant barrier that I've experienced with these portfolios is the property control. A lot of the 515 products are not held by, they're held by mostly by individual investors or owners that may own 2 or 3 properties. Some may have just the one property. There's very few that a large number are held by the same entity. And trying to find a willing seller to start with, and being able to put those under contract and have the seller carry that contract through what can be a very long time frame. It's not unrealistic that you're going to need a minimum of 3 years between putting a property under contract and getting the tax credit allocation, the funding put together, the applications, and getting the application with USDA RD through their approval process. It's a long time frame. And sometimes identifying those sellers can be difficult given the time frame. Further underlying the difficulty, and I'll talk about a little bit of this more in the process, is that ownership structure that's in place can be a barrier in itself. A big barrier with control and ownership of these 515 properties is going back to when I discussed the history of the property, and that a lot of these properties were funded for their tax benefits. Well, those tax benefits have burned off, and the investors are no longer receiving any additional tax benefits, but they now have a significant tax liability. So that when these properties change ownership, they may be faced with a higher tax bill than what they're going to receive in proceeds. And for some of these owners, they're not willing to give back those tax benefits that they harvested 20, 30 years ago and pay the bill now. For a lot of these owners, really the only way to avoid that tax impact is to pass that property through their estate. They'll basically die owning this property, and at that point in time, their estate or their heirs get an increase in basis, and that tax deferral becomes permanent, but it's at a pretty high price. So those are some of the issues you come across with the property, gaining control of the property and putting these portfolios together. For example, with the Colorado properties, our company started acquiring control and interest in these properties almost 5 years ago. So we've been holding on to these and putting them into a larger portfolio that now gives us an opportunity to say, okay, we've acquired 16 to 20 properties, and now we can start pulling some of these properties out for acquisition and rehab as they fit into our pipeline. So that is a huge barrier, and to me, like I said earlier, probably the most difficult barrier there. And other barriers is cost to these portfolios. There is a number of upfront costs that you have to incur, not just with, in our case, with the initial acquisition of the properties, what we've outlaid, which is a long-term recovery, but also all of the pre-development expenses that go into the application. You have your property reports you have to put together, the legal fees that you might incur to set up the application, and if you're working with a consultant, you're going to incur costs there, and so that can be a barrier itself if you don't have a lot of capital available. And that typically the cost you incur prior to your application and receiving a funding is going to have to be borne by your organization in one way or another. Once you do receive an allocation of tax credits, additional funding opportunities or financing can come through potentially your investor, who will help fund some of those pre-development costs to get it to close. But you do have to get that allocation usually before you're going to find anyone to finance. There's just too much risk up to that point with the applications to bear that cost through a loan or other means. The portfolios can be extremely complex. You're dealing with multiple properties that you have to blend together with different ownership structures, different restrictive agreements in place on the properties. There's also different levels, different financing components to it. And you have to start blending those all together. And just because you've been able to identify a portfolio and of 4 or 5 properties does not necessarily mean that those 4 properties are going to marry well together into a portfolio. So there's a lot of complexity to it that you need to work through, and their status with RD. And so there's a lot of work involved with identifying the opportunities and doing the financial feasibility analysis that we'll go over with. And so there's a time commitment along with the financial commitment to making a portfolio. And this isn't unique to portfolios. You still have to do the same thing whether you're putting a 9% application together or any type of application. It's just that it's the additional layering of properties and blending of properties. It's like you're putting, for our Colorado application, it's almost like you're putting 4 applications together rather than just 1. And so the volume of work goes up, as does the cost. And then you also, on top of that, you have your application fees. One thing that we found in Colorado, they have the $10,000 application fee with CHFA, but if you're putting together a portfolio, and this was a real, we had to discuss whether or not we were going to make this commitment when we looked at our Colorado portfolio, is that they actually charge that fee on a per property basis. And so instead of a $10,000 application fee, we had a $40,000 application fee for 4 properties. And that's a pretty significant cost and a risk for something that's competitive. So it gave us a little hesitation whether or not that was the commitment we were going to make, and we eventually determined that given that we already have an ownership interest in these properties that we were putting in the portfolio, that yes, it justified the additional cost. With the 4% tax credits, it requires a lot more funding sources to make up that gap. And so once again, it's more work. You're meeting with multiple agencies, in the case of Colorado, through DOLA and local sources, looking to fill that funding gap. And there's the higher initial capital outlay with just every property requires a phase 1 environmental report. Every property requires a market study. Every property individually requires an appraisal, your property condition assessment. Each property requires that. So the portfolio just takes that cost and multiplies it by the number of properties you're putting into that portfolio. And then it's the timeline is longer. From the point where you start identifying potential properties for your portfolio, getting those under contract with the owner, negotiating those agreements, it's not unrealistic that you're looking at a 3 to 5 year total time frame if things go as planned. Could be even longer if you don't get an allocation You may have sellers that drop out if you don't get the allocation. Your whole portfolio could fall apart on you after one application, and sometimes it takes 2, maybe 3 applications before you're successful. And so it really requires a commitment from the sellers, commitment from your organization to make these work. And those all represent barriers to getting a portfolio done. You know, despite the barriers, there are, I think, well, obviously we believe that the benefits outweigh the barriers. We've organized our organization such that we've reduced some of the risk of these barriers and capitalized on some of the benefits. And so it's something that's worked well for our organization. Next slide. Let me take a look at some of the any additional questions we might have. What about donating property to a nonprofit? That in of itself is probably above my ability to assess whether or not that's a strategy that would help reduce that tax impact. I don't know the answer to that question, whether or not that donation would be effectively nullify the tax impact or not. That's going to be your holdup with any transfer, is what's that impact to the seller.
And Russ, just to add in there, in Colorado, nonprofits aren't automatically tax exempt for the properties they own, so it wouldn't necessarily change the tax implications in this state, but I know different states have different rules. So just one other layer of complexity to answer that question. But there was one more question about, again, about these tax implications from Bonnie Craigie. Can you explain a little bit more about how you acquire them when they have to pass through a state? How do you then gain control?
Well, that actually facilitates the process, because when I'm talking about the tax impact, I'm talking about the income tax impact to the seller. When you recognize, and I'll try to keep this really high level, when you collect those tax benefits in the way of depreciation, usually what you're getting are tax benefits in excess of your investment. And so you end up with what's called a negative capital account. So you've received more in benefits than you've paid for them. And that's, but when you go and sell the property, you're just deferring those taxes, is all you're doing. Once you go and sell the property, you're going to recapture those tax benefits, but at typically a lower rate than hopefully you realize them. That's the whole tax planning strategy behind it, is if you have a high wealth individual whose taxable income is being taxed at that point in time, could have been as high as 70%. That when at some point down the road, when you sell the property, the tax characteristics have changed and you recapture that tax rate at like a 25% rate. But you're talking about properties that may have little to no value from a real estate perspective. So an example, when they go to sell these properties, they may have a tax liability of $100,000 on the sale of this property, but their proceeds from the sale may only be $25,000. And so while they've realized the tax benefits 20, 30 years ago, and they reduce their taxable income back in that period of time, at this point in time, when they're going to sell the property, they're actually going to have to come out of pocket $75,000 to pay that tax liability. And when the property passes through an estate, the value to the recipient of that estate gets brought up to the current value of the property at the time of the death of the decedent. And so at that point in time, those tax benefits become permanent. And the new person that owns the property out of the estate can now sell that property. And if the property is worth $25,000 in cash, they get the $25,000 in cash with no tax implications, because that's what their basis is. So very complicated issue. Hopefully I've distilled it down simply enough to understand what the issue the seller might have with that.
No, thank you, Russ. That one does come up a lot, is this fact that the seller might have to, they see it as kind of a penalty, right, to have to pay these taxes, and it takes out of whatever they could gain from the sale. So thanks for helping clarify that a bit.
And that's where, okay, go ahead, Robin. Sorry.
I was just saying, Russ, we have about 5 minutes, so I just want to let you know.
I've really been droning on, haven't I? I was worried I'd run out I'd have too much time. But I'll go through the process really quick. You know, that's the first we've covered with quite heavily is identifying and securing the properties to go into your portfolio. The next step is to assess that regulatory and legal restrictions on the property. At this point in time, you really have to also want to understand the impact on the seller for the sale of the property. The last thing you want them to do is not understand the tax ramifications of their decision until you're 2 weeks away from closing, when they've finally told their CPA they're selling this property that they've owned for 30 years. And he's telling them, well, get ready to write a check for $100,000. And they're all of a sudden not so willing to sell you their property. And that could tank your entire portfolio right before close. So that needs to be addressed. You prepare a financial feasibility on your portfolio, make sure that given your expected resources that you can meet the needs of that property. Then you go through your development of your scope of work, your construction cost estimates as part of your feasibility analysis to make sure you can meet the rehabilitation requirements that you want to meet with the property. You're identifying all of your funding sources and getting commitments for that. And at that point, you're probably ready to put in an application with CHFA or whatever state LIHTC financing agency is there. And if successful with that, there's a whole process that I think was covered fairly thoroughly on an earlier seminar with submitting approval for that transfer of that asset through rural development. And then you close, you do your rehab, place in service, and you're off to the races. We'll probably go ahead and with limited time, we could take a quick look at just we selected 4 of the portfolios that we've completed in Oregon. We go to the next slides. Some of these were rehab with 9%, some were with 4%, and let's go to the next slide. Brookside Rose was just 2 properties in the portfolio. It was done with 9% tax credits, the assumption of the 515, and additional perm loan was all the financing required with the 9%. So the structure is much easier and less costly. Crest Butte, This was, next slide, please. This was rehabilitated in 2009 and was part of the stimulus funds that were made available when the investment market fell apart with that economic downturn. So that's how that was financed with some additional permanent debt, the existing 515, and then some local weatherization funds and other small sources on that project. Next slide, please. This was a 3-unit portfolio, and this one was financed with 4% tax credits. It was done through some gap funding that the state of Oregon makes available, and just a assumption of the existing 515. There was no additional hard debt placed on the property on this one. And the last one, this was a 9% deal with additional hard debt and some local, small local funding to complete this one. And it was a 3-unit property. So I'll just wrap it up real quick as we go to our, probably the next slide. Some of the important elements to make a portfolio successful is you have to have a very patient and flexible seller who understands what you're trying to accomplish and what their role is and the time frames required to do it. The nice thing is that if things line up for the seller, they've already held these properties for 30 years. Holding them for another 3 to 5 years sometimes isn't really that big of an issue. They're not looking to cash in and get out of the properties. If they've owned them a long time, they know that they're not particularly worth a lot of money from a cash perspective, and will work with you. You need the support of CHFA and your financing agency, because these projects are complex and they may take longer than a typical single property deal. Rural development is critical to your success. They will control the process, and you have to follow their guidelines. That's one of the definite experiences that we have. The better you work with rural development, the better your portfolio is going to go through this process. An experienced management team is important to position the properties for a portfolio, and also to help with the rehabilitation during the rehab process. A strong development team or consultant will help with putting all of the different pieces together and making sure that everything is structured properly. Legal counsel is critical with the bonds, making sure that you're meeting all the requirements with bonds and your investors and lenders. The better relationship you have with them, especially if they've done some of these with you, they won't be as cautious to know that this can work. And then with any rehab, especially when you're dealing with scattered sites, your general contractor is critically important, because they're juggling a lot of different requirements during the rehab.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Russ. And I'm going to take, I know I promised y'all a break, but I want to take 5 minutes and give folks a chance to ask some questions, because I think that this is something that we've got lots of questions on. I'll start with a question that I have. If you're working on a scattered site property and you've got bonds involved and there might be in multiple jurisdictions, how do you go about figuring out which jurisdiction you want to use for the bond for those bonds?
That is a Colorado issue. In Oregon, the Oregon Housing that issues the tax credits also handles the bond program, so it's seamless between the two. They're both With Colorado and the way the bond cap is allocated in Congress, that was a huge unknown for us. You know, we had the same question. We started doing, so how does this bond process work? And since we're applying for state tax credits, that helps simplify it because CHFA sets aside an allocation of bond cap specifically for state tax credits. Mm-hmm. But we also did reach out to the local jurisdictions that receive allocations because bond cap is a very valuable commodity in Colorado. And so we did also ask some of the local allocating agencies to allocate their bond cap back to CHFA specifically for our project to help meet that need.
Okay, thanks for that, because I think that it is a complicated question here in the state of Colorado for sure. And then a question about when you have such a geographic scattered site acquisition like you're doing with Estes and Lyman, I mean, those are far apart by miles. What are you, how do you handle property management and the stewardship of the properties once the rehab is complete?
Luckily, we have a local property management company. It's the same property management company that's been managing these properties for the last 20 years or more, actually really since they were built. They've been managing them and we have a good relationship with them, and we expect that they'll continue to manage those properties as long as we are part of the ownership also. So that's a benefit. When we in Oregon, when we're acquiring them from different owners who have their own management or third-party management, typically part of our requirement with the acquisition is that we consolidate management with our management company in Oregon.
Okay, so you have your own management company.
Yes,
got it.
We do.
Okay, got it. Okay, thanks. I just know that question will come up too because of the geographic distribution, sometimes it's hard to find a consistent property manager for multiple properties across the state. Okay, well, I don't think there's any other questions. Folks must have asked their questions throughout, and thanks for asking those questions throughout. So at that, I'm going to give everybody a 5-minute break. So if you could join me back at 11:10 sharp, which gives you 5.5 minutes, that'd be great. And if you continue to have questions, we can submit them in chat and Russ can get to them later, or we'll make sure we get those answered for you later on. But thank you so much, Russ, for your time and for your insight and for helping us to understand a little bit more about this portfolio style acquisition, because I think it's something we haven't seen a lot of yet here in the state of Colorado. And we're interested in figuring out all sorts of ways to preserve more properties here in the state.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. Bye. Okay. 5-minute break, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's 11:10. So as promised, we're back on and ready to hear from our next speaker. Our next speaker is Terry Barnard. Terry is one of my friends, and he has over 20 years of experience in the affordable housing industry, mostly spent in multifamily loan origination and underwriting. Also tax credit underwriting. Terry has been with Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, otherwise known as CHFA, for over 15 years and spent nearly 6 years with Enterprise Community Investment. I met Terry when I was working at Enterprise Community Partners in the same office back many moons ago. He currently manages the multifamily loan originations team here at CHFA and is an accredited lead green associate. So he can answer all of your green questions as well as we have this conversation today. So thanks, Terry. Thanks for joining us today. And we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Robin. And I still miss working with you. I'm here today to talk a little bit about CHFA's multifamily lending preservation efforts over the last 20 years. When I started at CHFA, I actually started at CHFA in '99 in the loan servicing department when I was a young guy with hair. And but I moved to rental housing in 2000, and at that time, preservation was really focused around Section 8. And MARA had just been passed, and that was where all those Section 8 contracts that were entered into in the early 80s and up to the late 80s, a lot of them were going to be expiring. And so a lot of tools were being created through MARA to make sure that those contracts could be extended, could be renewed. One of the big caveats in the MARA Act was that Congress didn't want to forward fund them like they had done originally. They wanted them to be more subject to annual appropriations. And one of the big things was for projects that had annual adjustments to where their contract rents would be above market. Congress said, well, we don't want to pay above market rents for those properties anymore. We want them to be comparable with the market, with the issue being, once you do that, then you raise a huge risk of these properties defaulting. And so they created what was called the mark-to-market program, which I still can't quite figure out if it's in existence or not. I think if a project is above market, it still goes to an office within HUD for a restructure. But essentially, that's what it is. It's the new rents are determined, the rehab needs of the property are taken into account, and basically all of that write down of the mortgage as well as the physical needs, that all sort of gets pushed into there's a partial payment of claim on the first, which to be eligible, it has to be an existing FHA loan. And then the rest of it gets pushed into subordinate financing. And so that was kind of where I cut my teeth, was on that program. And probably my first 3 or 4 years at CHFA were heavily focused on that, as well as I worked for the preservation manager at the time, who had reached out to a number of those Section 8 properties, all of them that were in the CHFA portfolio for loans anyway, and basically just offered them a chance to come in and refinance. And also did a portfolio analysis on every property to determine which were good candidates for refinance, which looked like they would generate more cash flow and have more sources than they would need, and versus those two that just didn't look like good candidates because maybe they just needed more rehab than the project could support, and it was already highly leveraged. And so I was kind of born into the rental housing arena in that environment, and so preservation was an early focus of mine. I left in 2005 and went to Enterprise, worked on the multifamily lending side there, and then the equity underwriting, equity syndication team, and then went back to CHFA in 2011, where I actually went back on the compliance side and that lasted about 8 months. And then I was sort of recruited onto the tax credit team because they really needed the extra capacity, and that's where my expertise was. And so after 3 years of that, the multifamily lending team was looking for another officer. And since I'd already done that, I really wasn't all that interested, but they came to me and said, well, we're kind of looking for more of a senior role, someone who can be more of a leader in pushing our programs forward and creating new programs and that. And so I took the leap and have been back with the multifamily lending team since 2015, early 2015. And then I had the manager position opened up in 2017, and so I applied for it now. So now I basically oversee our multifamily production and outreach function. Right now, our efforts on preservation obviously are including, we have a preservation manager in Beth Truby, who you all know. And so she's managing the preservation database, which was all put together through the work of several organizations. And our financing can basically finance any preservation deals. We are seeing quite a few come through, but there's lots of financing options out there now that people can use that are very competitive. So we don't have as much activity going on as far as lending in preservation, but we're still heavily focused on it. And so that's what I want to focus on now. Is I want to get into a little bit about what we do on the multifamily lending side. Most people know CHFA as the tax credit allocator and as the for our home ownership program, which is really our bread and butter for providing home loans and down payment assistance to home buyers. But we also have a multifamily lending arm and a business lending arm. And so I'm focused on what we do on the multifamily lending, particularly around preservation. So next slide, please. Okay, so what we've been known for historically is providing long-term, permanent, fully amortizing permanent loans. We can do this with 4%, 9%, and non-LIHTC projects. So anything out there that meets the criteria. CHFA was actually created by the General Assembly in 1973 to help with the affordable housing crisis. And we are not an agency of the state. We don't operate through any tax dollars. We're quasi-governmental, and we're fully self-sustaining through our own programs. And with the long-term fully amortizing perm loans, it was something that a lot of lenders, it's a little unique in that most lenders have more of a balloon structure. And this is really, it's an attractive program for especially nonprofits and people that have the mission oriented towards affordable housing, because they can kind of lock in that long-term pricing without having to worry about a balloon structure in, say, year 15 or 16 or 17. But at the same time, if they want to prepay after 10 years, they can do that. And so CHFA statutorily is required to set aside a certain percentage of our units for statutorily, without any programs, without tax credits or bonds, it's 80% to 120%. But when you have tax credits and bonds or our FHA insurance involved, then we have to meet that lower standard of 20% at 50% AMI and 40% at 60% AMI. Most of the deals we do are 100% affordable anyway, so it's not really ever a concern. We also, in recent years, have gotten into construction to perm loans, strictly on 4% tax credit projects. And the reason for that is just because the bond market today is a little different than it was years ago, when we could lock in the permanent costs at construction close. We can still do that, but the mechanism to do it is different now. And it's less expensive and more efficient if we're the construction lender as well. But there's several ways that we can structure that, and I'll get into it a little bit. We also have some flexible funding. Every year, we set aside 10% of our net income into our Housing Opportunity Fund, or also known as HOF, which is the acronym. And we've used this subsidy for years as a low interest loan behind either a CHFA senior. We've also done a number of deals where someone else is the senior lender, and we've done the second. We prefer to be the senior lender just because it's more efficient. We can, in our oversight, it's more efficient to do and to use. But we have the ability to use that for affordable housing, tax credit housing, non-tax credit housing. Sometimes deals are small enough that we can just fund a first loan with HOF money. We've also used this in our middle income program, which I'll talk about a little bit later. There's so much flexibility in how we use this. And this is really one of the big, I think, best tools that we have to help, especially in rural preservation, where maybe the deals are smaller and they don't they don't have the opportunity for tax credits because there's no efficiency there. Then the last couple of programs that I want to talk about really are more for gap financing. Our Healthy Housing Program is one that we administer. They're actually funds from the Colorado Health Foundation, but these provide up to $500,000 in second mortgages to affordable housing projects that commit to building, basically having a healthy focus in their design. And there's some location elements to it too, being located a certain distance from grocery stores and so on. And basically, in addition to that $500,000, there's some programming grants that can be provided too for resident services. And then capital magnet funds. We've applied the last 3 years. Actually, we just applied for the 4th time, and we got 3. We're 3 for 3 on capital magnet fund awards. These are funds that are awarded through the CDFI fund, which is part of the Treasury nationally. We're using these funds basically to help gap financing in affordable deals, mostly tax credit deals, but we're allowing up to $750,000 per project in these, and I'll get into the details a little bit and as we go along. So next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about our 542C risk-sharing mortgage insurance. Some of you may be familiar with FHA insured programs and going through MAP lenders, and FHA provides mortgage insurance generally that covers the entire mortgage, or up to 99% of the mortgage. But you go through a MAP lender who then puts together a package that's pretty prescribed, and then they send it on to HUD. It's generally it's very time consuming, but essentially you get the best rates in the market, and you get a fully insured loan. These can go up to 40 years on a new construction, or up to 35 on a rehab. And so the attractiveness of it, you kind of lose out in time, but the attractiveness of it is you end up with a really good rate, and then that credit enhancement that's really attractive to investors. There's a program out there that came out in the mid-90s, this 542C program, that's used with housing finance agencies like CHFA. And this is where it's another credit enhancement tool. It provides full insurance on a project, so that if a project defaults, it will pay a full claim to make the investors whole, or make the lenders whole. And what happens though is, once we dispose of the property, we share the loss with HUD 50-50. So CHFA takes 50% of the risk, HUD takes 50% of the risk. And what that allows is, it allows for CHFA to be the underwriter. So we're underwriting the loans in lieu of HUD, and it allows for a much quicker time frame as well. And so we're using this program mostly for loans that are over 3 million. If there's anything that's under 3 million, we can usually fund those with internal resources, uninsured, which makes those much more streamlined and faster even than the HUD program. But the 50-50 structure does allow us to have a lot of flexibility in that. The other thing it affords us is that the mortgage insurance premium is the lowest of any FHA program in the industry at 12.5 basis points. So that's just something else that we can use. Typically, again, on smaller deals, we don't tend to use this because the economies just aren't quite there. Okay, next slide. So this shows a little bit about these are basically our loan programs, and we're currently working on renaming these into something that's more like Simple. Simple has worked out really well for us. Small multifamily permanent loan program. We'd like to have names that kind of resonate with that for all of our programs, and we're currently working on it. But this will show you basically that the first and second programs, the recycled bond 9% and Simple, both are long-term perm loans. We use the 4% program for larger construction to perm loans. Again, flexible funding with HOF, and then secondary debt with Healthy Housing and Capital Magnet. Okay, next slide. This is a little bit more detail on each of these. Again, as I mentioned, we typically, anything under 3 million, we can typically fund in-house with our own resources. The recycled bond 9% program, it's It was originally just called the 9% program, which it can actually be used for lots of things outside of the 9% program. It can be used for 4% deals where if the perm loan is small enough, we can just issue a forward commitment and then just issue bonds to a private construction lender, so the tax exemption can be used during construction, and then we can take it out with a much smaller taxable source. So it's really more of a recycled bond program. Where the funds come from is in our indenture, taxable bonds that have been paid off. We don't have to use those funds to redeem the bonds like we do on the tax exempt side. So we can basically recycle these taxable funds, and that's what we've done, is put them back into the community to make these loans. If they're over 3 million, typically they do use risk share. The simple is one that we created about 2 or 3 years ago, where we determined that we really had the capacity to do $1 to $3 million loans uninsured, and that way we don't have to go through HUD for the risk share. You're only dealing with CHFA. Our underwriting process is typically 60 days to get from application to commitment, and then from there it's usually 60 to 90 days is the process to get to a commitment on our simple program. Our 4% program, again, construction to perm loans, there's several ways we can structure it. CHFA can be the construction to perm lender. We can do risk share during construction. We have a limited capacity to do uninsured construction during this construction period, and that's probably the most competitive project or product that we have, is doing it uninsured and then taking it out with a risk share insured loan. We can work with a bank partner to do either like a cash collateral model, similar to a Fannie MTEBs, where the bank is providing a loan to cash collateralize the bonds, which then are basically used in the construction, and then the loan basically converts to a risk share perm at the end. That's a great question, and it's actually a great one I will answer right now. What programs require prevailing wages? The risk share during construction does require prevailing wages, or Davis-Bacon, and that's on those particular projects. That's why our uninsured construction to risk share perm is the most competitive that we have, because we don't have to use risk share during construction, and we don't have to incur Davis-Bacon. On projects where another funding source is requiring Davis-Bacon, it usually makes sense for us to go ahead and propose it as a risk share during construction, since Davis-Bacon is already involved. That way the credit enhancement is there, and it's less. There is some risk tolerance to CHFA. Like, as I mentioned, we have a limited capacity to do uninsured construction financing, because we're rated by the rating agencies. Too much construction lending too can hurt, or too much uninsured lending can negatively impact our credit rating, and we're really working hard to not have that happen. So cash collateralized or private placement with a bank partner is also a structure we can use. And generally these are for loans that are greater than $6 million that are utilizing risk share. But to be clear, risk share during the perm period does not incur Davis-Bacon, only risk share during construction if we use it that way. And so if we're doing a risk share forward commitment, it's usually another construction lender or a bank that's using their own funds, and those don't involve prevailing wages either. Again, the HOF, we usually use this to do direct loans under 1 million. We can also use it as an interest rate subsidy. As I mentioned, we can use this for so many flexible uses that it's a great tool for us. I hit healthy housing pretty good. The one thing I want to mention on Capital Magnet again, these have some of the terms on them: 3% interest. Healthy housing is a 17-year term with a 30-year AM. Capital Magnet, 3% interest, 17-year term, 35-year AM. What we do allow on this is if you use CHFA for the senior debt, up to 20% of the Capital Magnet fund can be used as a grant to the project that actually flows through the nonprofit partner or the housing authority. And so we've actually done this as a first loan on some newer rural deals, particularly around new construction. Okay, next slide. The general requirements that we have on most of our financing, we generally do have a 10-year lockout requirement. And that's just usually tied to the fact that we issue bonds for our funding sources. And in order to get the pricing that the good pricing that we get, we have to promise to the investors that there won't be a prepayment for 10 years. Generally, once that 10 years is gone, you can prepay at any time. We used to go up to 15, but those were a little problematic. So we're basically just at 10. Some of our smaller financings, we might go 5. In some cases, we have not had lockouts, but it just kind of depends on the situation. Our funding is generally non-recourse because we use FHA, and even in our uninsured, non-recourse meaning if the loan defaults, then we're not going after the sponsor or the borrower personally. We're going after the real estate to make ourselves whole. Minimum 115 debt coverage. That's a little bit different on acquisition rehabs and 4% deals. We've actually revised that now to be 120 minimum. We do size our loans up to the lesser of 90% of value or total development cost, which I think is a little bit advantageous over banks and maybe the GSEs. An interesting thing that we allow also is that loans that are already in our portfolio, we can refinance them up to 100% at cost, meaning the entire development cost of refinancing can be put into the loan just as long as it doesn't exceed 90% of the property's value. Okay, next. That in a nutshell is kind of our suite of programs, but I would like to talk a little bit about some things we're seeing in recent years, in the last few years. One is what we've been hearing is it would be great if CHFA could get involved in mobile home park financing. You know, these are mobile homes are in every community and in a lot of rural communities, and they're highly sought after because they generally are cash cows. I mean, the infrastructure expenses are low. The lot rents that the owners collect are what they are, and they're generally highly sought after by investors. And so what happens is that when they go up for sale, you see investors come in from out of state usually and buy them up, and then they'll end up jacking up or increasing the rents on the lot rent, and potentially pricing out folks. And there have been a lot of news cases and things where mobile home parks they're not, zoning sort of is going away from them, and some cities seem to be wanting to do away with them more than they want to create new ones. And so preservation of mobile home parks is something that's been an interest to us in recent years. And we actually did participate in our first Rock USA model that they acquired a property up in Longmont, mobilized the residents to form a co-op to basically buy the park from the existing owner, and CHFA helped finance that. That's one of the easiest ways we can get involved. But also if a developer comes to us, or a local nonprofit or somebody locally, and says, there's a mobile home park for sale, we'd like to try to buy it, can CHFA help financing? We'll definitely look at doing that too. And we just basically, I think that would be a HOF loan. That would be a housing opportunity fund where we can have some flexibility in looking at it. I mentioned our middle income program. This is another one that's become more popular recent years because of the economy and the way that housing has become so expensive in Colorado. You know, market has gone from where it was almost at the 60% level years ago to, 100% or 110%. So you have these folks that are between 60% and 120% of AMI that are over income to qualify for tax credits and bonds and things like that, but they can't afford market. And so they're kind of stuck in that missing middle is what we call them. And so we've worked with on several projects. The thing with these is because they do charge a little bit higher rents, they can incur much more debt. These look more like market rate deals, but they still end up having about a $4 to $6 million gap that needs to be filled through some kind of mezzanine program. And so CHFA has been working on filling those gaps with our HOF funds, also through participating lenders that we're working with, because CHFA, we'd like to limit our exposure on those to about $1 million to $2 million each with each project, and then bringing in participating lenders to kind of help spread out that risk a little bit. And then finally, small scale housing. This is one that we have hired we had Karen Harkin in our Western Slope office for years that just retired earlier this year. We're currently working to hire someone out there. We have someone in Pueblo now, Caroline Tranny. We have someone in Alamosa and Jeff Owsley. So we're regionalizing. We have people in local communities. And not only through, we've heard this internally at our home office in Denver, but through them, we're hearing a lot about the need for small scale housing. And so what we're thinking about are projects that are generally under 20 units. We've had projects come in that have been proposed to be 4 units, and or just to maybe take an existing building and convert it into affordable housing. And it might be 6 units, it might be 8 units or 12 units. And when you look into these are almost, they're much smaller loan amounts, but the risk in them is greater because you don't have the economies. A blip in expenses might tank the whole deal if you're not careful. You know, how do you underwrite vacancy in a 4-unit deal, an 8-unit deal? There's a lot of things to consider. And so we have put an innovation team together, and let's go ahead and go to the next slide on this. We've been kind of doing this innovation framework to work on these different issues over the last few years. And our innovation project around small scale housing was aptly called SHIP, Small Housing Innovation Project. And how can CHFA facilitate the development, preservation, and management of smaller housing projects under 20 units? So using the innovation framework, which is basically where we pull together a team cross-organizationally, we define the problem, we go through a discovery phase, which in this case, we interviewed, I think, over 30 organizations, over 50 people, some of which are even on this academy. And based on that feedback, we came up with an ideation. We said, well, what products or what programs can we create with this? We came up with some prototypes. We're currently working to refine those, and then we'll be going back out for some feedback from the market. And from there, we'll be able to finalize some new programs. So in identifying what need is out there, we came up with a number of potential product ideas. Acquisition financing, which was asked, you know, during Russ Merrill's presentation. How do you acquire properties? Partnering with local lenders. Do we just do perm loans? Do we do construction to perm loans? Can we help out with single family development construction loans? On our single family side, we're not direct lenders. We're secondary lenders. We buy loans on the secondary market, but we don't originate them. We have a network of lenders that originate the loans, and then we buy them from the loans as long as they meet our criteria. But we don't have a single family construction program. And so that's something that's come up that seems to be a big need, especially in rural locations where people can use manufactured housing or indie dwell, or those that are doing container housing, and those newer technologies to just bring it in and put it down and basically open it. That's much quicker and in theory less costly than stick built. The other thing in the need we ascertained was basically the need for technical assistance. And I'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about that as we move forward, but next slide, please. So as I mentioned, small scale housing, the need is not just about financing, there's a need for technical assistance as well. So what we did in our basic group was we split into 2 subgroups, one to focus on finance and one to focus on technical services. So in our finance subgroup, we determined that the best thing we could do based on who we are and what we have and the resources is to continue to do direct permanent loans like we do. The other thing we came up with was multifamily collateral support. On our business side, we have a cash collateral support program, and what that does is it helps, for instance, businesses that go to a bank, a local bank, and they apply for a loan, but the bank is not comfortable doing, say, 80% loan to value, or there's something about the developer's financials or something, they're just not comfortable enough doing that loan. CHFA will take, and they're funds that we administered through the state, and now we have our own funds that we're doing this with, where we basically deposit some cash into an account with the bank, and it's just kind of a backstop. It's just there to give the bank, it's a collateral support to help the bank then make that loan to the business. And we thought, why don't we do that on the multifamily side too? We would prefer rural deals to use their local banks, because then all the money stays in the community. CHFA doesn't want to come in and be the the state agency that comes in and sort of takes business away. We would like those deals to work with local banks, but if we can help support them or help them to make a larger loan, say up to 90% of loan to value, if we can deposit some cash with them to provide some collateral, then we think that'll work. And we've had some really good feedback, some positive feedback from banks that we've worked with on the business side. And so we're currently working right now to define what that program is going to look like, what the parameters are going to look like, and who our participating banks are going to be. But I think that's a good way we can support, especially rural projects that are looking to expand affordable housing, whether it's turning something into affordable housing and through adaptive reuse, or whether it's acquiring something that's already there and preserving it. The technical services subgroup has come up with a number of tools to use, one being online, being a place where developers can go and learn a lot about how to put deals together, how to put small deals together, what the resources are. Doing some group toolkits, like the Division of Housing does their developers toolkit. Right now, Jeff in our Alamosa office and Andrew in the Alamosa CDOH, the Division of Housing office, are working on basically a rural housing toolkit, which I think will be a good thing to have for smaller developments. Having some on-call technical assistance or someone that developers can work with. We're in the process of issuing an RFP to basically have a provider work with us who would be largely that technical assistance provider to help local developers, local municipalities to get through that process, because so often rural projects, they know the need and they have the want and they know what the need is, but they don't have the expertise or the resources to do it. And so this is a way that we're trying to bridge that gap. And so we hope to have someone on board fairly quickly. And then the ability to have small grants for soft costs, whether those funds are through CHFA or through another entity. There are entities out there that do this kind of thing to kind of help with some of the pre-development or some of the soft costs that maybe come into that 10%. If we're going up to 90% of the loan to value through the bank, then there might be some other soft costs that can be paid for elsewhere. Okay, next slide. I'm going to give a couple of preservation examples that we have done in the last several years. Steve Cordova, I noticed, was on the call earlier, and I haven't looked recently, but I assume he still is. Morningside Heights, Stephen's organization owns this property. This is a 50-unit project that was built in 1973. It serves single residents up to larger families. It's got 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units in La Junta. It's 100% rent subsidized by Section 8. Applied to CHFA in 2013 for 9% credits, and these were awarded. It had about 9.7 million in total development costs. 5.8 million of that was in hard rehab costs, which is about 116,000 per unit. So on top of the tax credits, then CHFA also provided a 30-year perm loan of $1,787,000 through our risk share program. And I know what I said earlier is we're not using risk share for anything under 3 million anymore, but at that time we were still using risk share on this. And so it's, as our programs have been refined, we're able to do higher loan amounts without using FHA. But if we have to go higher, then it's a great tool for us to use because it credit enhances our ability to get investments or investors involved. And other sources on this deal included CDBG funds, the Division of Housing, the sponsor put in contributions, the deferred developer fee is usually a big thing in the stack, as well as the tax credit equity. And this one supported the tax credit equity because of the size. I mean, 50 units is a good size for 9% credits, especially. And with the amount of rehab that this project needed, this was a perfect fit for it. So next slide. These are a couple of pictures of the property before the rehab. And then next slide. These were after some of the exterior work was done. Not entirely complete, but these were a little bit older pictures, but they show you the work that was done on the exterior there to really bring these properties up to, to give them the TLC and the care that they needed. And so I think Steve's done a great job with this. And I know there's some future plans with this too that potentially involve PACE financing, and I'd really like to see that because this is a great asset to the community of La Junta. Okay, Next slide. This is another one we did as a 4% construction to perm, Casa del Sol in Pueblo. It's 154 units. It was built in 1970. It's got studios, 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. Again, serves single residents all the way up to some larger families. It's 100% rent subsidized through a Section 8 mod rehab contract. And if you know anything about the history of those, they were prohibited for up until, I believe, the HERA Act in 2008 or 9 from getting tax credits because of some scandals that had happened back in the 80s. And so through the HERA Act, they were allowed to apply for credits. And a lot of them, because they couldn't get credits and they were limited in the amount of rent increases that they received, they got quite tired. A lot of them really fell into disrepair. And so this one is taking advantage of the RAD program. This one's a RAD 2. So it's going through a RAD 2 conversion where the mod rehab project or contract will be converted to a project-based contract with project-based vouchers, still 100% rent subsidized. This one received an award of 4% credits in 2019, 22.7 million in total development cost, and then 8.1 million in hard rehab costs, which is about 53,000 per unit. And so we'll go ahead to the next slide. Our financing that we provided on this, we did provide a 2-year uninsured construction loan of 15.5 million. That's going to convert to a 38-year, $13.3 million perm loan with risk share upon the stabilization of the property. Once the rehab is all done and it restabilizes, which should happen fairly quickly, because the rehab's being done with folks in place, it'll turn into a 38-year perm loan. We also provided a $700,000 CMF Capital Magnet Fund loan, as well as a $50,000 grant to the project itself. The other sources on this one included funds from the Division of Housing, deferred developer fee. There is some net operating income from operations, which is one thing that preservation deals can take advantage of, especially if they are moving people back in. If they're not relocating people, or if they're only relocating people for a limited time and then bringing them back, there's usually some net operating income that happens during construction because there's usually no perm debt that's being paid for at that time, and as well as tax credit equity. Okay, next slide. So this is a picture of the property before rehab. Did have some needs on the inside, but the exterior especially really needed new stucco, and the stairs particularly were not up to code, and they were in some cases potentially dangerous. Okay, next slide. This is during rehab. I don't have any post-rehab pictures because it's not completed yet. These are just a couple pictures showing a couple of the new staircases that they put in to the project. You can see that, and they've done some new stucco work on the outside. Still not complete, but you know, will look much improved once it's all done, and they have these units preserved for the residents of Pueblo. And I really hope that the residents in that right picture on the top right 2 units, I really hope that they are not going to just open the door suddenly. No, I'm assuming they're gone. They're not there. So, okay, next slide. So that is all I have for my presentation. So if I guess we have about 2 minutes.
Awesome, thank you. I didn't turn my mic back on in time for you to hear me laughing. I thought your joke was funny, Terry, about the stairs. Does anyone have any specific questions for Terry? If not, I have questions always. That's why this gets to be my job, because I always have questions.
There's one from Steve here, it looks like.
Okay, fantastic.
So SHIP, when do you anticipate it to roll out and be available to access? It's really available now. I mean, we're trying to figure out what the parameters are, what kind of vacancy we use for however large a project is. But if you have a project, I would say, come talk to us. We'll go ahead and look at it now and see what we can do.
Great, Steve. That was exactly how I was going to ask the question too. Is if there's a project we have, we're not sure where it fits, would it just be great to reach out to you, Terry, and kind of go through that? Great. And that kind of brings into my question about the healthy housing program. Mm-hmm. Can that be used for rehab on small rehabs, or if you're acquiring like a naturally occurring rental property that you're converting into? Could that be a source to do some minor repair?
It can, as long as it meets the criteria. And I think that might be the challenge. It's just that some of the newer elements, that are involved might preclude an existing property from meeting some of them, but it's not impossible for sure. So they definitely can be used for that.
Great. And yeah, so I'm excited too about the work that y'all are doing with SHIP, and I know that Jenny on our team at Enterprise has been working really closely with your team on the new lending product as well, and so I'm very excited about that.
And we think that lending product too can be used through the Small Housing Innovation Program as well.
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully it gets rolled out so that we can introduce it as part of, before the end of the year and as part of the academy. And if not, we'll make sure that everybody who's taking part in this will get to know about that product too, because it is really looking at those 10, 12 unit properties, which I think is a lot of our stock out in rural parts of the state.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Hold on, SHIP. Again, wait, no, that's the same question. Oh, CHFA rocks, Steve says. And shout out to Terry and Caroline and everyone out there. And I would really second that. CHFA has been a really good partner in our efforts on preservation, and what you all are doing with the SHIP team, and also Beth in particular with the preservation database. Terry referred to that at the beginning, and we did talk about it in early sessions, but if you're interested in looking at specific communities where you work and want to know more about the stock that is at risk of losing its affordability, then we can definitely schedule some time for you and to meet with Beth and talk through kind of what those specific opportunities might be too, because CHFA is really concerned with making sure that we are preserving our units in the state. I think according to like Beth's slides early on that we heard, there's 72,000 affordable units that are at the risk of or are going to be expiring in the next 15 years. And we can't meet that gap. We can't, with new LIHTC projects, we have to make sure we're preserving those units so they don't get lost in the process. So.
And I was going to add that 20 years ago when I started doing this, preservation was just really about Section 8, Now It's about expiring, because back then there were no year 15 properties. Now you've got all the year 15s. Those are expiring tax credits, lots of expiring use agreements and things to look at.
Yeah, lots of LURAs that are expiring as well. Right, and now we have, CHFA has longer LURAs, but the ones that were built 30, 20 years ago, those are expiring as well. So yeah, there are a lot of units at risk, and it's something that we really need to focus on. Well, I'm going to give folks a little bit of time back today. It's always good to have that time for the break. Larry Anderson said, great idea about bringing in local banks to provide funding for the small RD projects. And then he wants to know, what is the best way to get that going, or how have you seen that work, Terry?
I would say, because we've talked to a number of banks, probably the best way to do it is get the interest of the local bank and see if they're interested in financing it, and bring us in to talk to them, about what we're proposing. Because I think that's what we're looking at doing with this is really thinking about how it's going to work. It's really going to be modeled, I think, off of our business program, because it works really well. In concept, we have a general idea of how much we would need to put in and help collateralize it, but we just need to get the banks on board that we can work with to do that.
Great, that sounds great. I'm excited about that too. And then one more question I have about, I know you guys do have the outreach folks in different parts of the state, Pueblo and Alamosa, and you will on the Western Slope once that gets resettled.
And
Four Corners. Okay, that will be new too, right? So as those come online, should the folks that are on the call that are in those parts of the state reach out to that person, or should we still be contacting you, here in Denver, or how should that work?
Either way, the community relationship managers are out, they live in the communities that they're serving, so that the folks in those areas have someone to contact who can be, more personable to them. So whatever folks are comfortable with, you can call us in Denver, or call us locally.
Awesome. Okay, well, we are going to wrap up, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to be on the call. Thank you so much, Terry, for presenting to us today. And we're excited about continuing to do this work on preservation in partnership with CHFA and, you know, all the other groups that it takes to make these kinds of projects work, which is kind of everybody. And as you log off, you'll have a quick survey, so do it that way, and then I won't send you a survey after. And remember, September 23rd, we have a regional buyer sellers conference, and I'd love to see all of you on the call in attendance at that too, so to register for that. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.